Let me read to you a passage from the Gospel of St. Mark, chapter 8, verses 27 to 33. It's the Gospel for Thursday of the 6th week in Ordinary Time. St. Mark writes, Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Along the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They said in reply, "John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter said to him in reply, "You are the Christ." Then he warned them not to tell anyone about him. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be put to death and rise after 3 days. He spoke this quite openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. At this he turned round and, looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." That's from Mark chapter 8, verse 27 to 33. What does it suggest to us? Well, it's generally recognized that the Gospel of Mark is basically the account of our Lord's public ministry, his passion, his death and resurrection as preached by Simon Peter, especially in Rome. Peter refers to his companionship with my son Mark, as we read in the first letter of St. Peter, chapter 5, verse 13. It looks as if Mark wrote his Gospel, perhaps after the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, primarily for Gentile believers in Rome who were suffering. Our passage today can be taken as a climax of the first part of his Gospel, narrating from chapter 1 verse 16 to chapter 8 verse 30, narrating our Lord's widespread ministry in Galilee, including visits to Gentile regions. Who is this Jesus? That's the question, and there is much confusion about his identity as a prophet, and our passage reports something of this. The content of Mark's story revolves around this question, and it is indeed the question of the ages. Who do people say I am? Our Lord then asks the question of those he has called to be his disciples, and who indeed regard themselves as being such. But who do you say I am? To be his disciple, one must get this matter right. It is Peter who gives the answer, which is not only a grasp of the truth about Jesus, but is the key to all of the scriptures. You are the Christ. We notice immediately that our Lord does not want this to be known at this point, for we read that he warned them not to tell anyone about him. There was a widespread misunderstanding of the work of the Messiah, who had been foretold in the scriptures. It was desired and expected that God would send another and greater David-like king to liberate the people from foreign occupation. Liberation from this world's ills was the desire of so many, an earthly utopia. Our Lord's disciples, with Peter at their head, living closely with him and seeing his holiness and his work of liberating so many people from the burdens of Satan, sickness and sin, had recognized in him the promised Messiah. So, as represented by our Lord's close disciples, the recognition by God's chosen people of God's Messiah had come. The beginning was now made to the grand enterprise of bringing the promised blessing of the Messiah to the chosen people and to the Gentiles, to all the families of the earth, as God had foretold to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. But there was an even deeper recognition at stake, for at the beginning of his gospel, Mark tells the reader who his account is about. It is about Jesus Christ, that is, Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. Since we're considering Mark's account, let our mind's eye look ahead to the end of his gospel. The interesting thing about Mark's composition is that while he shows our Lord's disciples, specifically Peter, professing before Jesus that he is the promised Messiah, Mark chooses to give the profession of his divine sonship to the pagan centurion as he witnesses the extraordinarily holy death of Jesus on the cross. This is the climax of the story of the recognition of who Jesus is, and may be said to be the climax of the second part of Mark's Gospel, which is the Passion narrative, beginning from chapter 8, verse 31, and going to chapter 15, verse 47. The great question was, who do people say that I am? Mark tells us that when Jesus breathed his last on the cross, the centurion who stood facing him said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Mark chapter 15, verse 39. We are not obliged to presume that the centurion had a perfect appreciation of how very true were the terms he used of our Lord. But Mark is making his point that just as in the disciples it had been recognized that Jesus was the Messiah, so in the pagan centurion, the Gentile world, for whom actually a Messiah meant little, had begun its recognition that Jesus is the Son of God. Of course, he is not saying that the disciples themselves, including Peter, had not reached this recognition. Mark was writing for Gentile believers in the heart of the pagan empire, Rome itself. Jesus Christ, dead on the cross, is the Messiah and Son of God. The empire will recognize this, as it did at the end of much persecution with the rise of Constantine. Well then, all of this having been said, let us return to our scene for today from Mark chapter 8, verse 27 to 33. While Peter, through Mark, recounts his profession that Jesus is the Messiah, we learn from Matthew that this conversation between Christ and his disciples had a greater significance. It may have been that out of humility, Peter gave to Mark and his audience in Rome a reduced account of the scene because during it, so we learn from Matthew, he was granted a high dignity by Christ, following his profession of our Lord's true identity. For what did Peter say in answer to our Lord's question? According to Matthew, it turns out that he said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Matthew chapter 16, verse 16. This profession was the goal of the Gospel of Mark. Clearly it was the goal of the Gospel of Matthew, and it was explicitly so of the Gospel of St. John, as we read in chapter 20, verse 31 of that Gospel of St. John. The Gospel of Mark shows the Messiah ever on the move throughout the land of the chosen people, primarily Galilee, but also Judea, while on his way to Jerusalem for his passion, beginning chapter 10, verse 1, and even beyond into the Gentile regions, as we read in chapter 5, verse 1, chapter 7, verse 24, to chapter 8, verse 30. Some came to him from Gentile regions, as we read in chapter 3, verse 8. I like to think of the emphasis Mark gives to Christ's free-ranging public ministry in Galilee as an emphasis on his concern for the Gentile world, because Galilee was much more cosmopolitan than Judea. This was the Messiah, Abraham's descendant, and the blessing for all the families of the earth promised by God to Abraham. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. He is the fulfillment of all the promises. He was accepted as such by his disciples at the end of his Galilean ministry, as he was about to make his way to Jerusalem for the final stage of his work. let us accept him totally.